Tonight, imagine standing alone in a castle. Not outside it, inside. You're standing in a cold stone room lit by a single candle, and in your hands is a document that's almost 500 years old. The paper is vellum, made from animal skin, and it's yellow with age. The ink is fading, but still legible, written in a careful hand by someone who is being paid to be precise. This is a castle inventory from the 5th-10th century. This is a list of everything that belonged to someone powerful enough to own a castle and hire someone to write down what they owned. You probably wouldn't last long here. The castle is cold in ways that modern heating has made almost impossible to experience. The stone walls are thick, designed to keep enemies out, but also to keep warmth out. The windows are small and covered with shutters or oiled cloth rather than glass. There's no central heating. There's no electricity. There's no warmth except what fires can provide, and fires require fuel, and fuel requires money. So most of the castle is cold most of the time. You're standing here in candlelight because daylight is almost gone, and in a few hours, it will be completely dark. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening late at night, or early in the morning, or in whatever corner of the world you happen to be in right now, leave a comment with your location and the local time. You're keeping vigil with this inventory too, in your own way. You're awake and conscious in a moment when most people are asleep, and you're paying attention to a document that most people have never heard of. A list of objects that have mostly turned to dust. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The document in your hands is the Castle Ledger, the inventory. It's not a story. It doesn't have a narrative arc. It's simply a list. Item after item, listed with descriptions, quantities, and sometimes values. Reading it is not like reading a novel or a history book. Reading it is like reading a catalog. It's methodical. It's repetitive. It's hypnotic in the way that lists can be, the way that the accumulation of small details can create a texture that feels almost alive, almost like presence, even as it documents absence. But that's exactly the point. The inventory exists because something is gone or about to be gone, or because it needs to be tracked, or because someone wealthy enough to own things felt the need to prove they owned them by writing them down. The inventory is proof. The inventory is permanence, or at least the attempt at permanence. It's the castle's way of saying, we exist, we have stuff, we are real. And you're standing here in candlelight reading it. The candle is probably expensive. Tallow candles smell bad and smoke, but they're cheaper. Beeswax candles smell better and burn cleaner, but they're a luxury. You're probably reading by tallow candlelight, and the smell is slightly acrid, slightly animal, slightly wrong. The light is wavering, which makes the words seem to move on the page. You have to hold the document close to your face to read it. Your eyes strain. The cold seeps into your fingers. But you keep reading, because the inventory is fascinating in a way that only the obsessive documentation of the mundane can be. Someone, 500 years ago, walked through this castle with a ledger and wrote down what they saw. They counted, they measured, they described. And what emerges from all of that careful notation is not a sense of presence, but a sense of vast, careful absence. Everything here is gone. Everything here has decayed, or been sold, or been lost, or been burned. The only thing that remains is the list. The castle itself might still be standing. Castles are durable things. They were built to last. But the things inside it, the furniture, the tapestries, the food, the warmth, the people, all of that is gone. The only evidence that any of it ever existed is this document, this list, this careful notation of what was here in 1450 or 1480, or whenever this particular inventory was written. And as you read deeper into it, as the candlelight flickers across pages of careful handwriting, you begin to understand something about the medieval castle, you begin to understand that it was a place of almost incomprehensible stuff. Every room is full of objects. Every object is catalogued. The castle is less a home and more a repository, a storage facility, a museum of possessions. And all of it had to be maintained, had to be protected, had to be remembered, had to be written down. You turn the page carefully. The vellum is fragile. Your fingers are cold. The candlelight flickers. And the list continues. Item after item, object after object. The inventory goes on, page after page, and you have barely begun. Counting the linens that will rot, this is where the inventory begins to reveal its true nature. Begins to show you not a castle, but a collection. Not a home, but a warehouse of textiles and cloth and woven things that are slowly, inevitably, turning into dust. The pages in front of you are filled with the word sheets. Sheets for beds, sheets for tables, sheets for wrapping things. Sheets made of linen, made of wool, made of combinations of fibers that you can barely imagine. And each one is listed. Each one is counted. You read 23 linen sheets, worn but serviceable. You read 14 wool blankets, undyed. You read 31 tablecloths of Flemish linen, some stained. The numbers accumulate. You're not reading about individual objects anymore. You're reading about categories, linens, textiles, cloth. The castle apparently owned linens in quantities that seem almost incomprehensible. Enough to supply a small town. Enough to fill rooms. Enough to suggest that textiles were not luxury items, but somehow fundamental to the way the castle understood itself. This is because in the 15th century, cloth was currency. Not in the economic sense, though certainly cloth was expensive and valuable and tradable, but in the sense that cloth was how wealth was displayed, how status was communicated, how a castle announced to the world that it was important enough, secure enough, prosperous enough to own vast quantities of beautiful woven things. A peasant might own one set of clothes. A merchant might own several. But a castle owned hundreds of textiles. And yet, as you read the descriptions, the reality of decay becomes unavoidable. Worn but serviceable means that the linen is falling apart, but hasn't given up completely. Stained means that something has marked it permanently. And in a world without modern cleaning, a stain was often a death sentence for a textile. Undyed might mean economical undyed cloth was cheaper than dyed cloth, or it might mean that the castle was planning to dye it themselves, or it might mean that this was simply what happened when an inventory was written, a careful notation of what was there, even if what was there was not quite as beautiful as it once had been. The inventory is ruthlessly honest about deterioration. It's almost shocking. This is a document that's supposed to be celebrating wealth, supposed to be proving that the castle's owner was rich and important and surrounded by beautiful things. But instead, it's documenting decay. It's listing things that are broken, stained, worn, damaged, incomplete. It's creating a portrait of a castle that's slowly falling apart, where even the most valuable things are being eaten away by time and use. You understand, as you read this section, that cloth in a medieval castle was not like cloth in a modern home. Cloth here was under siege. The climate was damp. Mold grew on it. Insects ate it. The people using it were not gentle. They didn't understand that you could be careful with fabric the way modern people might. Cloth was used hard. Cloth was washed in ways that damaged it. Cloth was stored in conditions that encouraged decay. So the castle had to own vast quantities of it, because the castle knew that cloth was not permanent. Cloth was temporary. Cloth required replacement. Historians still argue about how much cloth the average castle actually used. Some scholars suggest that the inventories are inflated, that people writing them exaggerated the quantities to make their employers seem wealthier than they actually were. Other scholars argue that the quantities are accurate, that castles really did own that much cloth, that the obsession with linens was genuine and reflects a real need for constant textile replacement. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, some exaggeration, some accuracy, and an overall sense that linens were important enough to list, valuable enough to track, important enough to the castle's sense of itself that they needed to be documented. But what's not in question is the fact that all of this cloth is gone. Every single sheet listed here, every tablecloth, every blanket gone. Decayed, rotted, turned to dust, or perhaps burned, or perhaps given away, or perhaps discarded when it became too worn to be useful. The castle that owned these linens is long gone. The people who slept on these sheets are long dead. The tables that these tablecloths covered no longer exist. And what remains is a list, a careful notation, a ghost of cloth. You're reading about wealth as the documentation of ephemeral things. You're reading about status as the accumulation of objects that cannot last. You're reading about a castle owner who understood on some level that everything they owned would eventually decay, would eventually be gone, but who nevertheless felt the need to write it all down, to create a record of it, to make it permanent through documentation, even though the actual objects were temporary. There's a kind of madness in that, isn't there? The impulse to document that which cannot last, the effort to make permanent that which is fundamental. The kitchen's copper and its strange hierarchy, you've moved deeper into the inventory now, and the pages are filled with descriptions of metal, pots, pans, kettles, cauldrons, vessels, of every conceivable size and purpose, all made of copper, all catalogued with a reverence that the linens never quite received. The copper items have prices listed next to them. The linens did not. This tells you something important about how the castle understood value. Copper is permanent in a way that cloth is not. Copper doesn't rot. Copper doesn't decay. Copper can be damaged, can be dented, can be bent, but it can be repaired. Copper can outlast the people who use it by centuries. And the castle seems to understand this. The copper items are described with more care, more attention, more precision than almost anything else in the inventory. One large copper cauldron, suitable for boiling water or rendering lard, with a capacity of approximately 15 gallons, handle intact, slight denting on the eastern side. This is not a casual description. This is documentation by someone who understands that this object matters, that this object will outlast the current castle administration, that this object is worth preserving. You're reading about the kitchen's infrastructure, and as you read, you begin to understand the hierarchy of the castle. The copper comes first. The food itself barely gets mentioned. You read about the equipment for preparing food in exhaustive detail, but the food, the actual sustenance that kept people alive, gets almost no attention at all. You find brief mentions of stores. Grain in the North Tower, quantity not measured. Salted meat, several casks. Ale, quantity unknown. It's almost as if the food was so transient, so temporary, so fundamentally perishable that it wasn't worth documenting carefully. But the equipment that processed the food, the metal vessels that contained it and cooked it, those things mattered enough to list, to measure, to value. This makes sense if you think about it correctly. Food is the most temporary thing a castle can own. It spoils, it gets eaten, it's gone. But a copper pot lasts forever. A copper pot is real wealth. A copper pot is something that can be inherited. A copper pot is something that proves you're rich, because you can afford to own something so expensive just to cook in. Poor people cooked in iron pots, if they cooked at all. Copper was a luxury. Copper was status. The kitchen inventory lists copper items by size, by condition, by purpose. One medium copper pot, suitable for stewing, with a lid. 3 small copper pans for frying. 1 very large copper cauldron for rendering fats. The descriptions are technical. They're precise. They're the descriptions of someone who understands the value of what they're listing, who understands that these items need to be tracked because they're too valuable to lose. But here's what's strange. Most of this copper is gone too. You're holding a 500-year-old document that lists copper items that may have been melted down, may have been sold, may have been lost in wars or fires, or simply discarded when newer pots became available. The permanence of copper is theoretical. Yes, copper lasts longer than cloth. Yes, copper is more durable. But that doesn't mean it survives. It just means that if it does survive, it survives in a form that's recognizable, that can be studied, that proves its identity. There is a strange irony in the fact that the most permanent items in the castle are described with the most precision, while the most temporary items, the food, the people who ate the food, are barely mentioned at all. The inventory is like an inverted pyramid of documentation. The most fleeting things get the least attention. The most permanent things get the most attention. As if the castle understood, on some deep level, that permanence was what mattered, that what would survive into the future was what deserved to be remembered. You read through the kitchen section, and you understand that you're rereading a portrait of abundance and waste. The castle had enough copper to fill an entire section of the inventory. The castle had enough pots to cook for hundreds of people. But was the castle actually cooking for hundreds of people every day? Or was this excess, this overabundance of equipment, itself a form of status? Was the castle saying, through the act of owning more pots than necessary, we are so rich that we can own things we don't actually need? Historians still argue about the actual use patterns of medieval castle kitchens. Some scholars suggest that the equipment listed in inventories was rarely, if ever, fully utilized, that the castle's actual cooking was done by a small staff in a fraction of the space, using a fraction of the equipment. Other scholars argue that the inventories list only the most valuable items, that there was probably much more equipment that wasn't listed because it wasn't worth documenting. But what seems clear is that the castle understood copper as a form of wealth storage, a way of keeping money in a form that was both useful and permanent. The copper is still here, in some form. If this castle still exists, some of the copper might still exist. But the people who used it are gone. The hands that held these pots, the bodies that consumed the food that was cooked in these pots, the entire human context that made these objects meaningful, all of that is gone. And what remains is a list, a careful notation, a ghost of copper gleaming in the candlelight of a kitchen that no longer feeds anyone. Wine cellars and the ghosts of forgotten merchants. You've turned another page. And now the inventory is taking you underground into the cellars where the castle stored its wine. The quantities listed are almost incomprehensible. Barrels upon barrels, casks upon casks. Wine from Bordeaux, wine from Burgundy, wine from regions you've never heard of, all stored in darkness, all supposedly preserved in conditions that would keep them drinkable for years. You read 347 barrels of Bordeaux wine, vintage unknown, some showing signs of leakage. 347 barrels. That's a number so large that it barely makes sense. How many people would it take to drink 347 barrels of wine? How long would it take? Would the castle actually consume all of this wine? Or would much of it turn to vinegar before anyone ever drank it? This is the question that haunts this section of the inventory. Not whether the wine was good, not whether it was valuable, but whether it was ever actually consumed. The wine cellar is a kind of gamble. You buy wine when it's cheap or available. You store it. You hope that either you drink it before it spoils, or that it will increase in value while you're restoring it. But medieval wine storage was not a precise science. Conditions in the cellar varied. Barrels leaked. Temperature fluctuated. The wine that you stored 3 years ago might be perfectly preserved, or it might be completely ruined, and you wouldn't know until you opened the barrel. The inventory notes this uncertainty, some showing signs of leakage. This phrase suggests that the person writing the inventory actually went down to the cellar, actually looked at the barrels, actually assessed their condition. And what they found was that some of them were leaking. Wine was seeping out. Wine was being lost. The carefully stored wealth was deteriorating. You begin to understand that the wine cellar was not just a storage facility. It was a speculative venture. The castle owner was betting on the future. They were betting that they would have guests to entertain, that they would have occasions that required expensive wine, that the wine would be better in the future than it was in the present. And they were betting that the wine would not spoil. Some of them were losing that bet. Some of the barrels were leaking. Some of the wine was being lost to time and circumstance. There's something almost melancholy about reading the wine inventory. You're reading about the castle's hope for the future, preserved in barrels in a dark cellar. You're rereading about the castle owner's desire to be able to offer the best wines to important guests, to demonstrate wealth and sophistication through the wines they could provide. And you're reading about the slow deterioration of that hope, the slow loss of that wine to leakage and time. The wine merchants who sold this wine to the castle are long dead. The ships that carried the wine from France to England or wherever this castle is located, those ships are long gone, broken up, turned to wood chips. The vineyards that produced the wine, some of them might still exist, but many have been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The entire supply chain that brought this wine to this cellar is gone, and the wine itself is almost certainly gone. Either it was drunk, or it turned to vinegar, or it leaked out of the barrels and seeped into the stone floor of the cellar. Historians still argue about the wine trade in medieval Europe. Some scholars suggest that the wine listed in castle inventories was primarily for display, that it was too valuable to actually drink, that it was meant to demonstrate status rather than provide sustenance. Other scholars argue that medieval people actually did drink a lot of wine, that the quantities listed in inventories represent actual consumption patterns, that castles really did go through these enormous quantities. But what seems undeniable is that the wine trade was a major enterprise, that moving wine from production regions to consumption regions was a complex operation, and that the castle's wine cellar was a node in a vast commercial network that connected it to merchants, ships, vineyards, and trade routes. And all of that is gone now. The network has dissolved. The merchants are dead. The supply lines are broken. The wine that was so carefully stored, so carefully preserved, so carefully documented, most of it has vanished. The only evidence that it ever existed is this list, this inventory, this careful notation of barrels and casks and quantities that can no longer be verified. You're reading about absence disguised as presence. The wine cellar in the inventory is full. The wine cellar in reality is empty. 500 years have passed, and the wine has had plenty of time to disappear. Either it was consumed, which is what it was meant for, or it spoiled, which seems likely given how much of the inventory mentions deterioration and leakage. The castle owner who created this inventory, who documented the wine cellar so carefully, is gone. The guests who would have drunk the wine are gone. The entire context in which the wine made sense as a possession has vanished. But the list remains. The careful notation remains. The ghost of the wine cellar remains, preserved in ink on vellum, waiting for someone 500 years later to read it by candlelight and wonder what happened to all of that wine, wonder whether it was ever drunk, wonder whether the castle owner ever actually opened those carefully stored barrels, or whether they simply sat in the cellar, slowly turning to vinegar, slowly leaking, slowly deteriorating into nothing. The armor that outlasted the bodies it protected, you're moving through the inventory now into the armory, and the tone of the documentation shifts again. Here, finally, is something that the castle seems to take completely seriously. The armor is listed with meticulous care. Every piece, every suit, described by its components, its condition, its approximate value. One complete suit of plate armor, circa 1440, some rust on the gauntlets, otherwise serviceable. 3 suits of chainmail, one with broken links on the left shoulder, 2 in acceptable condition. 12 breastplates, various ages, ranging from heavily dented to nearly pristine. The armor is treated with a reverence that even the copper pots didn't quite receive. Because armor is not just equipment. Armor is the castle's defense. Armor is the physical embodiment of the castle's ability to protect itself and its inhabitants. Armor is what stands between the castle and its enemies. And so the armor is carefully counted, carefully described, carefully valued. The castle understands that armor is important in a way that linens are not important, in a way that even wine is not important. But as you read through the armor descriptions, you begin to notice something unsettling. The armor is being cataloged as objects, but the people who would wear the armor are almost completely absent from the inventory. There are no descriptions of the knights who owned the armor. There are no names. There are no indications of which suit of armor belonged to which person, or whether the armor ever actually protected anyone, or whether any of the knights who wore this armor survived the battles they fought in. This is the strange power of the inventory. It reduces human experience to objects. The knights are gone killed in battles, died of disease, aged out of service, left the castle. But the armor remains. The armor will outlast any human who wore it. The armor is permanent in a way that the human body is not. And so the inventory catalogs the armor, preserves the memory of the armor, makes the armor eternal through documentation, while the people who wore the armor are forgotten. You're reading about a form of permanence that is actually quite cruel. The armor survives. The armor is documented. The armor will potentially still exist 500 years from now, still recognizable, still identifiable as the armor it was. But the knight who wore it gone, dust, no documentation, no record. The inventory doesn't say, this suit of armor was worn by Sir William during the battle of such and such, and he died in it. The inventory just says, one complete suit of plate armor, serviceable condition. The human story is erased. Only the object remains. There are occasional hints of the people behind the armor. A suit that's described as well worn, presumably was worn frequently, worn by a knight who saw a lot of action, a knight who perhaps was skilled, or perhaps was just unlucky enough to be sent into battle often. A suit that's described as nearly pristine might have belonged to a young knight, or to a knight who was high enough status to not be risked in actual combat, or to a knight who simply didn't fight much. But these are just hints. The inventory doesn't tell you the stories. The inventory just tells you that the armor exists. Historians still argue about what castles actually did with all the armor listed in their inventories. Some scholars suggest that the armor was kept as a reserve, that the castle maintained more armor than it had, knights to wear, so that if reinforcements came, or if new soldiers needed to be equipped, the armor would be available. Other scholars argue that some of the armor was so old or damaged that it was essentially decorative, that it represented the castle's history, the battles that had been fought, the knights who had served. But what seems clear is that armor was valuable enough to preserve, to list, to track, even when the castle may not have had immediate use for it. The armor is gone now, mostly. Some of it might still exist in museums, in private collections, in castles that have survived. But most of it has been melted down, has been reforged into new armor, has been lost in fires or wars, or simply discarded when it became too damaged to be useful. The permanence of armor is theoretical. Yes, metal lasts longer than flesh, but that doesn't mean it survives intact. It just means that if it does survive, it survives in a form that can be studied, measured, analyzed. You're reading about the inventory's obsession with objects at the expense of people. The armor is real. The armor is documented. The armor is permanent, or at least potentially permanent. The knights who wore the armor, they're gone. And the inventory seems to accept this trade-off. It seems to say, we will preserve the objects. The people will disappear. This is the way of things. The armor will outlast the bodies it protected, and that's just how it is. There's a kind of horror in that, if you think about it. The castle is creating a world where things matter more than people, where objects are preserved while humans are forgotten, where the inventory can tell you everything about the armor, but nothing about the knights. The castle is saying, through the act of creating this inventory, the material world is what matters. The human world is temporary. Document the objects. Let the people fade away. Tapestries depicting scenes no one will remember. The pages turn again, and now you're reading about the visual heart of the castle. The tapestries, the great woven cloths that hung on the walls, that depicted battles and hunts and religious scenes, that provided color and warmth and meaning to the stone rooms. The inventory describes them with a detail that suggests someone understood their importance, understood that these were not just functional textiles, but bearers of meaning, carriers of stories. You read, one large tapestry depicting the hunt of the White Hart, Flemish work, circa 1420, some fading to the colors on the left side. You read, a series of 6 tapestries showing scenes from the life of St. George, of English manufacture, good condition, depicting the saint slaying the dragon and various other episodes of his martyrdom. You read, one tapestry of great size showing a medieval feast, with numerous figures engaged in eating and drinking. Some wear crowns, suggesting nobility, some fading around the edges. These tapestries were expensive, enormously expensive. They took months or years to weave. They required skilled labor. They required dyes that were themselves expensive and difficult to produce. A single large tapestry could cost as much as a small estate, and the castle owned dozens of them. This tells you something about the castle's wealth, yes, but it also tells you something about what the castle valued. The castle valued visual beauty. The castle valued stories told in thread and dye. The castle valued the ability to turn its walls from bare stone into surfaces of meaning and color. But the inventory's descriptions are strangely impersonal. Yes, the tapestries are described their subject matter, their size, their condition. But there's no sense of what the castle owner felt when looking at them. Was there a favorite tapestry? Were there particular scenes that held special meaning? Did the lord or lady of the castle stand in front of the White Hart tapestry and think about their own hunts, their own adventures? The inventory doesn't tell you. The inventory just catalogs. The inventory just describes. And the condition descriptions are haunting, some fading to the colors. This suggests that the tapestry has been hanging in a room with windows, that sunlight has been slowly bleaching the dyes, that the bright colors that the weaver worked so hard to produce have been slowly disappearing. The tapestry is a clock. The fading is the hands moving. The tapestry is slowly becoming invisible, slowly blending into the walls, slowly losing its ability to communicate the stories it was meant to tell. There's something particularly sad about tapestries in a medieval inventory. Unlike armor, which might be preserved in a treasury, unused, waiting for a time of war, tapestries are meant to be seen. Tapestries are meant to hang on walls. Tapestries are meant to be looked at every day. But that very use, that very act of being looked at, being exposed to light, being lived with, destroys them. The light that allows you to see the tapestry is the same light that fades its colors. The air that allows people to gather in the room and admire the tapestry is the air that carries the dust and insects that damage the fibers. So the tapestries are dying while being used. The castle knows this. The inventory notes it. Some fading, condition declining. The castle is documenting the slow death of its most beautiful possessions. And the inventory is the only way to preserve the memory of what they looked like when they were new, when the colors were bright, when the stories they told were vivid and clear. The tapestries that are described here are almost certainly gone now. Even if the castle still exists, even if some medieval tapestries have survived into the modern world, the specific tapestries described in this inventory are likely to be lost. They've been exposed to 500 years of light, 500 years of dust, 500 years of insects and mold, and whatever environmental conditions the castle has been subjected to. The fibers have degraded. The dyes have faded completely. The stories they told have become invisible, but the inventory preserves them. The inventory says, there was a tapestry here. There was a story here. There was meaning here. The words in the inventory are the only thing that survives. The visual image is gone, but the words remain. A series of 6 tapestries showing scenes from the life of St. George. That sentence is all that's left. That description is all that's left. And you're reading it 500 years later, and you understand that this is what the castle owner was actually preserving when they created the inventory. Not the tapestries themselves. Those were always going to fade, always going to decay. But the memory of the tapestries, the words, the documentation. Historians still argue about how tapestries were actually displayed in medieval castles. Some scholars suggest that the tapestries were hung seasonally, that they were taken down and stored when not in use, that they were carefully managed to minimize fading. Other scholars argue that tapestries were hung permanently, that the castle didn't have the resources to manage them so carefully, that fading and decay were simply accepted as part of the cost of having beauty in your life. But what seems clear is that tapestries represented an enormous investment of resources, that their presence in the inventory indicates their importance to the castle's self-understanding, and that their gradual disappearance through fading and decay was a slow loss that the castle had to witness and accept. You're holding a document that describes the visual appearance of rooms that no longer exist. The tapestries are gone. The walls they hung on are gone. The people who looked at them and derived meaning from them are gone. But the words remain. The inventory remains. And in reading it, you're reconstructing those rooms from language, from description, from the careful notation of someone who understood that beauty is temporary, but words are permanent. The bed hangings and the intimacy of decay. Yvette turned to a section of the inventory that feels almost private, almost as if you're violating something by reading it. The bed hangings, the curtains and drapes and textiles that surrounded the Lord and Lady's bed, that created an enclosed space within the larger room. That provided warmth and privacy, and a sense of enclosure in a castle that was otherwise cold and exposed. You read, one set of bed hangings in crimson wool, with gold thread embroidery depicting roses, somewhat worn but still serviceable, with 4 corner posts of carved wood. You read, another set of bed hangings in blue linen, faded but intact, with a matching canopy frame. You read, a smaller set of bed hangings for a child's bed, in green wool, condition poor, missing 1 corner curtain. These are the textiles that were closest to the body. These are the things that the Lord and Lady woke up to every morning. These are the things that created a private space in a world where privacy was rare. The bed hangings were not just functional. They provided warmth, yes, and they blocked drafts, yes. But they also created a kind of sanctum. When you were inside the bed hangings, you were enclosed. You were protected. You were in a space that was meant for you alone, or you and your spouse alone. But the inventory lists them the way it lists everything else. As objects, as items with conditions to be noted, somewhat worn but still serviceable, faded but intact. The intimacy of the bed hangings, the fact that these were the textiles closest to the most private moments of the Lord and Lady's life, is completely absent from the description. The inventory doesn't care about intimacy. The inventory just cares about whether the item exists and in what condition. This is where the inventory becomes almost obscene, not in a graphic sense, but in the sense of revealing what should remain hidden. The inventory is describing the textiles of the Lord and Lady's bedroom, the things that hung around their bed, the things that were present during their most private moments. And it's doing so in the same objective, clinical tone that it uses to describe copper pots and wine barrels and suits of armor. The inventory is saying, these bed hangings are property. These bed hangings are assets. These bed hangings will be inventoried like everything else. The condition notes are particularly revealing. Worn, faded, missing 1 corner curtain. Someone has actually inspected these bed hangings. Someone has gone into the Lord and Lady's bedroom and examined the bed hangings and noted their condition. This suggests that the castle was being very careful about tracking its assets, that nothing was too personal, too private, too intimate to be included in the inventory. The bed hangings are being treated the same way the copper pots are being treated, as property, as things that can be measured, assessed, cataloged. You begin to wonder, as you read this section, who actually owned the bed hangings. Were they the property of the Lord and Lady personally? Or were they castle property, to be replaced when necessary, to be managed by the castle's administration? Did the Lord and Lady think of the bed hangings as their own possessions, intimate and personal? Or did they understand that they were actually castle assets, subject to inventory, subject to assessment, subject to replacement, at the discretion of whoever was managing the castle's affairs? The bed hangings that are described here are almost certainly gone now. Textiles are fragile. They don't last 500 years unless they're kept in perfect conditions, which medieval bed hangings certainly were not. The crimson wool with gold embroidery depicting roses. The color is almost certainly completely faded by now, if the textile still exists at all. The blue linen, it's been exposed to 500 years of light and dust and moisture. The green wool with the missing corner curtain that was already deteriorating when the inventory was written, and 500 years of further deterioration have probably reduced it to nothing. But there's something about the bed hangings that's different from the other items in the inventory. The linens will rot, the copper will corrode, the wine will turn to vinegar, the armor will rust, the tapestries will fade. All of these things are dying. But the bed hangings are dying in a particularly intimate way. Someone slept under these hangings. Someone woke up looking at them. Someone experienced some of their most vulnerable moments surrounded by these textiles. And now they're gone. And all that remains is a description. One set of bed hangings in crimson wool, with gold thread embroidery depicting roses, somewhat worn, but still serviceable. Historians still argue about the personal lives of medieval castle dwellers. We know so little about how they actually lived, about what they actually thought and felt, about the texture of their daily existence. The inventory provides facts. The castle owned bed hangings, but it provides almost no sense of the human experience, of sleeping in them, of waking to them, of existing within the intimate space they created. You're reading about the only evidence that remains of the Lord and Lady's private life. The bed hangings are gone. The people are gone. The bedroom is gone. But the words remain. The inventory remains. And in reading it, you're creating a kind of violation. You're accessing the privacy of people 500 years dead. You're reading about the textiles of their bed. You're witnessing the objectification of their most intimate space. And the only thing that makes this bearable is that the people are long dead, that privacy no longer matters to them, that all that remains is the documentation of what once was intimate, now rendered utterly impersonal by time and language. Silver and gold scattered across pages like stars. The inventory is moving now into the realm of precious metals, and the descriptions shift again. For the first time, you're reading about items that have intrinsic value, independent of their function. The copper pots are valuable because they're copper. Yes, but they're also valuable because they're useful. You can cook in them. The armor is valuable because it protects you. The tapestries are valuable because they're beautiful and they tell stories. But the silver and gold items are valuable for a different reason. They're valuable because they're rare, because they're precious, because they can be converted into money or melted down and reconfigured into something else. You read, one silver chalice, ornately decorated with religious imagery, weighing approximately 3 pounds. You read, a set of 12 silver spoons, engraved with the castle's coat of arms. You read, one gold brooch set with emeralds and pearls, weight and value unknown. You read, 3 gold rings, purpose unknown, various sizes. The precious metals accumulate as you read. Silver vessels, gold ornaments, jewelry, decorative items. All of it cataloged, all of it valued, all of it understood as wealth storage in its purest form. There's something different about the tome when the inventory is describing precious metals. The descriptions are briefer, as if the value of the item speaks for itself and doesn't require elaboration. 1 silver chalice. That's enough. Everyone understands that a silver chalice is valuable. Everyone understands that silver can be melted down and reconfigured. Everyone understands that silver is money in a form that is slightly more useful than bullion because it is also functional. You can drink from it, you can use it in religious ceremonies, you can display it to show your wealth. But there's also a kind of anxiety in the descriptions. Weight and value unknown. This suggests that someone looked at the gold brooch and realized they couldn't determine its value without more expertise, without possibly testing the gold, without potentially damaging it in the process of assessment. So the inventory simply notes that the weight and value are unknown and moves on. The gold brooch remains mysterious, its value undetermined, its purpose unclear. This is where the inventory becomes almost poetic in its revelation of uncertainty. The castle owner has everything cataloged except for the things that matter most. The precious metals are too valuable, too delicate, too potentially dangerous to handle carelessly. The precious metals can't be assessed without specialized knowledge. The precious metals might be damaged in the process of determining their true value. So the castle simply notes that they exist and leaves their assessment to someone else, someone with more expertise, someone with more access to the kind of knowledge required to evaluate precious things. You begin to understand that the inventory is not a complete accounting. It's a preliminary document. It is noting what exists so that someone else can come along later and do a more thorough assessment. The precious metals are too important to be dealt with casually. They require specialized knowledge. They require expertise. They require a kind of attention that the person writing this inventory doesn't have or doesn't want to claim. There's something almost touching about that. The castle is acknowledging its own limitations. The castle is saying, we own valuable things, but we don't completely understand them, and we don't have the expertise to assess them properly. Someone else will need to do that work. Someone more qualified will need to determine whether this gold brooch is actually gold, whether it's worth what we think it's worth, whether the emeralds and pearls are genuine. The precious metals that are described here are almost certainly still in existence somewhere. Metal doesn't decay the way cloth does. Metal doesn't fade the way tapestries do. Metal can be buried, can be lost, can be melted down and reconfigured, but it doesn't disappear. The gold and silver described in this inventory are theoretically still out there, still existing in some form, still containing the same material substance they contained 500 years ago. But the connection to the castle is broken. The gold brooch is no longer in the castle. It's either in a museum, in a private collection, in the ground somewhere, or it's been melted down and reconfigured into something else entirely. The silver chalice might still exist somewhere, but it's not in the castle anymore. The castle's precious metals have been scattered. They've been lost. They've been sold. They've been dispersed. Historians still argue about the precious metal holdings of medieval castles. Some scholars suggest that the quantities described in inventories were exaggerated, that castles didn't actually own that much silver and gold, that the inventory was designed to impress rather than to accurately record. Other scholars argue that the inventories are reasonably accurate, that medieval castles really did accumulate precious metals in the way the documents suggest. But what seems clear is that precious metals represented a form of portable wealth, that they could be converted quickly into money if necessary, and that therefore they were both valuable and vulnerable. The castle owner who created this inventory understood that precious metals were dangerous. Precious metals could be stolen. Precious metals could be lost in fires or wars. Precious metals could be seized by a more powerful lord. So the castle owner documented them. The castle owner created a record of what precious metals existed, so that even if they were lost, At least the memory of them would survive. The inventory is a kind of insurance policy against loss. But the loss happened anyway. The precious metals are gone. They've been lost to the castle. And all that remains is the documentation. One silver chalice, ornately decorated with religious imagery. That's all that's left. That description. That memory. That ghost of precious metal that once existed in the castle and now exists only in words on a 500-year-old document. The forgotten servants named only in the kitchen accounts. You've been reading through the inventory for quite a while now, moving through lists of objects, and you've almost forgotten that there were people in the castle. But suddenly, in the kitchen section, names appear, just briefly, just in passing. But they appear, and when they do, it's startling in its unexpectedness. You read, as recorded by the kitchen master John, who maintains the stores. You read, per the account of Margaret, the scullery maid, responsible for washing. You read, as noted by old Thomas, who has been in service for 40 years. These names appear almost accidentally, almost as if the inventory writer forgot that they were supposed to be writing about objects and started writing about people instead. And then the names disappear again, and the inventory returns to listing things. This is the only evidence in the entire document that there were human beings in this castle. The entire inventory could theoretically have been written about a castle that existed, but was empty of people, a purely material existence with no human presence. But the kitchen accounts require witnesses. Someone has to know how much grain is stored. Someone has to track the supplies. Someone has to maintain the kitchen. So the inventory mentions them, just in passing, just enough to indicate that the information came from these people's knowledge. But the inventory tells you almost nothing about them. John, the kitchen master, what does he look like? How old is he? How long has he been in service? Does he have a family? Is he paid well? Does he enjoy his work? The inventory doesn't care about any of that. The inventory just needs to know that John exists, that he has knowledge, that he can provide information about what's in the kitchen. Margaret, the scullery maid, the inventory, tells you only that she's responsible for washing. Washing what? Washing dishes? Washing clothes? Washing the castle? The inventory doesn't specify. And it tells you nothing about Margaret's life. Is she young or old? Is she a local girl, or did she come from somewhere else? Does she have any hope of advancement? Or is she going to spend her entire life washing things in the castle kitchen? The inventory doesn't care about any of that. Margaret is just a function. Margaret is just the person responsible for washing. Old Thomas the inventory notes that he's been in service for 40 years. This is actually remarkable. 40 years. Thomas has been in the castle for 40 years. That means he's seen changes. He's seen different lords come and go. He's seen the castle change. He's accumulated knowledge that spans decades. He's probably one of the most important people in the castle, in the sense that he knows things that no one else knows. He understands how things work. He has continuity that spans generations. And the inventory mentions him once, in passing, and then moves on. Old Thomas, who has been in service for 40 years. You begin to realize that the inventory is a kind of violence against the people in the castle. The inventory is turning them into functions. John is the kitchen master. Margaret is the scullery maid. Old Thomas is the person responsible for knowing things. They're not individuals. They're not complete human beings. They're just the sources of information about the objects in the castle. And they're almost certainly all dead now. 500 years have passed. Even if Thomas was young when he entered service 40 years before the inventory was written, he would have been at least in his 60s at that point. And now he would be impossibly old. Margaret is dead. John is dead. Everyone named in the inventory is dead. Their expertise is gone. Their knowledge is gone. All that remains is the mention of their function in the inventory. The irony is that these people, the servants, were probably more essential to the actual functioning of the castle than any of the objects being inventoried. The copper pots don't cook themselves. The wine doesn't store itself. The armor doesn't maintain itself. All of these objects require people to use them, maintain them, manage them. The servants are the bridge between the objects and their purposes. Without the servants, the castle would just be a pile of stuff. But the inventory doesn't care about that. The inventory documents the stuff. The inventory mentions the servants only when necessary to explain where the information about the stuff came from. The servants are ghostly presences in the inventory, barely real, almost invisible, notable only in their function as knowledge providers. Historians still argue about the lives of medieval castle servants. We know almost nothing about their actual experiences, about what they thought and felt, about the texture of their days. The surviving documents are written by people of higher status, and they mention servants only when necessary. So we know that servants existed. We know that they did work. We know some of their names, in cases where the documents mention them. But we know almost nothing about who they actually were, what their lives were actually like, what they actually cared about. The kitchen accounts are probably the most detailed record we have of servant life. Because the kitchen had to be tracked carefully, food was valuable, and the person responsible for managing it had to be accountable. So John's name appears in the inventory because John was responsible for something valuable. But Margaret's name appears only in passing. The scullery maid was less important economically than the kitchen master, so she gets less attention. Old Thomas's name appears because he had accumulated knowledge that was useful, but even then, he's introduced as Old Thomas, as if his age and his longevity are his only distinguishing characteristics. You're reading about the erasure of human beings from the historical record. The servants existed. They had names. They had skills. They had knowledge. Some of them, like Old Thomas, had decades of experience. But the only way they appear in the historical record is through the inventory, through the documentation of objects, through the passing mention of their function. The servants are ghosts in the castle, and the inventory candles enough to illuminate a small town. You've reached a section of the inventory that reveals something almost desperate about medieval castle life. The candles. The sheer, overwhelming quantity of candles. You read through page after page of candle listings, and the numbers accumulate in a way that's almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. You read 2,000 tallow candles, standard size. You read 400 beeswax candles, various sizes. You read 1,000 additional tallow candles, some damaged, suitable for melting and recasting. You read wax supplies in bulk, awaiting processing into candles, quantity approximately 100 pounds, 2,000 candles, 400 candles, 1,000 more candles. The quantities are staggering. This is enough candles to keep the castle illuminated continuously for months. This is more candles than you would think any single structure could possibly use. But here's what the inventory is actually documenting: the castle's desperation to push back darkness. 2,000 candles means that the castle is burning candles constantly, in every room, throughout the night. 2,000 candles means that the castle is paying enormous sums just to be able to see. 2,000 candles means that darkness is the castle's enemy, and the castle is willing to spend significant resources to defeat it. The candles are expensive. Tallow candles are cheaper than beeswax candles, but they still require resources: animal fat, which could otherwise be used for cooking or for leather work. Beeswax candles are luxury items. Bees produce wax, and that wax has to be harvested, has to be cleaned, has to be processed into candles. The castle is spending enormous resources just to make light, and the light that the candles produce is terrible by modern standards. Tallow candles smoke. They smell bad. They produce a weak, flickering light that barely illuminates a few feet in any direction. So to light a room adequately, you need multiple candles. To light a castle adequately, you need thousands of candles. And the castle is maintaining an inventory of 2,000 candles. which suggests that this is roughly what they use in a given year, or perhaps what they like to have in stock so that they never run out. There's something almost heartbreaking about this. The castle is surrounded by darkness. Medieval darkness is not like modern darkness. You can't turn on a light switch and suddenly see everything. Medieval darkness is absolute. It's complete. It's oppressive. And the only way to fight it is to maintain a constant supply of candles, to keep them burning in every room, to spend enormous resources just to maintain a small sphere of light in the face of overwhelming darkness. The castle is documenting its struggle against darkness. The inventory of candles is a kind of confession. It's the castle saying, "We are afraid of the dark. We are so afraid of the dark that we are willing to spend this much money to keep it at bay. We buy candles in vast quantities because we cannot live in darkness. We need light. We need it constantly. We need it in every room. But the candles are consumed. They burn down. They're used up, so the castle has to keep replenishing them. The castle has to keep buying more wax, has to keep processing it into candles, has to keep burning them. It's a kind of Sisyphean task. The darkness keeps coming. The candles keep burning out. And the castle keeps buying more candles. You begin to understand that the castle's candle inventory is not just about practical illumination. It's about control. It's about the castle's attempt to control its environment, to create a space of light and warmth in a world that's fundamentally dark and cold. The candles are a technology of control, and the castle is investing enormous resources in that technology, because the alternative, to live in darkness, to surrender to the natural rhythm of light and darkness, is unacceptable. The candles that are described in this inventory are all burned now. 2,000 tallow candles, all turned into smoke and heat and light, all consumed in the effort to push back darkness. The beeswax candles, all burned as well. The wax supplies, all processed into candles, all consumed. 500 years of candle burning have passed since this inventory was written. The castle has burned through tens of thousands of candles. The darkness keeps coming. The castle keeps lighting candles. The cycle continues. Historians still argue about the economics of medieval castle life. The cost of candles was significant. Some scholars suggest that the candlelight illumination described in inventories was actually rare, that most medieval people spent most of their time in darkness, that candles were lit only in specific circumstances or for specific occasions. Other scholars argue that the castle really did maintain constant illumination, that the cost was worth it, that the castle owner was willing to pay for light regardless of the expense. But what seems clear is that light was valuable, that darkness was feared, that the castle understood illumination as important enough to allocate significant resources to it. And yet, the light was always temporary. The candles burned out. The light was always inadequate. You could never light a room completely, never illuminate every corner, never completely banish the shadows. So the castle was constantly fighting a losing battle against darkness, constantly consuming candles, constantly trying to maintain a level of illumination that was perpetually insufficient. You're reading about the castle's futile struggle against the inevitable. The darkness always returns. The candles always burn out. The castle always has to buy more candles. And the inventory documents this endless cycle: 2,000 candles. And then next year, 2,000 more candles. And then the year after that, 2,000 more candles. Forever and ever, until the castle itself crumbles. And there is no more need for candles, because there is no more castle to illuminate. But the trying matters. The castle's refusal to surrender to darkness. The castle's willingness to spend enormous resources to keep light burning. This is a kind of resistance. This is the castle saying, "We will not live." The books that no one will read. You've moved into a different section of the inventory now, and suddenly you're encountering items that suggest intellectual life. Books. The castle owns books. This is significant. Most medieval castles didn't own many books. Books were expensive. Books were rare. Books required someone to read them, and reading was not a universal skill even among the nobility. You read one volume, bound in leather, containing religious texts in Latin, condition fair, some pages water damaged. You read 3 books of hours, richly illuminated, for use in prayer, various conditions. You read 1 volume describing the art of hunting, in French, illustrated with scenes of the chase. You read a collection of 6 volumes, subjects unknown, stored in the North Tower, not examined. The books are listed with less detail than almost anything else in the inventory. The tapestries get elaborate descriptions of their subject matter. The armor gets detailed assessments of condition. But the books are almost dismissed. Religious texts in Latin. That's all that's said about one of them. Art of hunting in French. That's all that's said about another. And then there's this devastating entry. A collection of 6 volumes, subjects unknown, stored in the North Tower, not examined. This is extraordinary. 6 books exist in the castle. No one knows what they are. No one has bothered to examine them. They're just stored in the North Tower, presumably gathering dust, presumably slowly molding in whatever conditions exist in the North Tower, and they're not worth the effort to actually look at them and determine what they contain. This tells you something profound about the castle's relationship to books. The castle owns books, yes. The castle is willing to preserve books, yes. But the castle doesn't actually care about the books. The books are not valued for their content. The books are valued as objects. They re-valuable because they're remade of leather, and paper and expensive materials, because they're rare and difficult to produce. But the actual knowledge contained in the books seems to be irrelevant. The religious texts in Latin are probably there because religion is important, because the lord or lady of the castle is expected to engage in religious practice, because books of hours are used for prayer. But this doesn't mean that the books are actually read carefully, or understood deeply, or engaged with in any meaningful way. The books are there as part of the furniture of religious life. They're part of the apparatus of piety. But whether anyone actually reads them, whether anyone actually benefits from the knowledge they contain, is unclear. The book on the art of hunting is interesting. This suggests that someone in the castle is interested in hunting, that hunting is important enough to justify owning a book about it. But the hunting book is described with the same casualness as everything else. Is it actually used? Is it actually consulted when the castle is planning hunts? Or is it just there, another object, another piece of status? And then those 6 volumes in the North Tower, those 6 books that no one knows anything about, those 6 books that aren't worth examining, those 6 books that might contain anything philosophy, history, medicine, literature, religious texts, poetry, and no one will ever know because no one has bothered to look. The books are stored, they're inventoried, they're noted as existing, but they're not actually engaged with. You begin to understand that the castle's intellectual life is probably very limited. The books are there, but they're not really being used. They're being preserved in the way that the castle preserves everything carefully noted, carefully stored, carefully documented. But the actual content of the books, the actual knowledge that they contain, is not being accessed. The books are just things, objects, items to be inventoried. This is particularly striking when you consider that books are the primary technology for transmitting knowledge across time. Books are how one generation passes information to the next generation. Books are how humanity accumulates and preserves knowledge. But in the castle, the books are just stored. They're not being read. They're not being engaged with. They're not being used for their actual purpose. Historians still argue about literacy rates in the medieval castle. Some scholars suggest that the lord or lady of the castle might have been able to read Latin, might have understood basic texts, might have engaged with the intellectual content of the books they owned. Other scholars argued that many medieval nobility were illiterate, that they owned books for status rather than for reading, that the actual content of the books was irrelevant to them. But what seems clear from this inventory is that the Castle-as relationship to its books was primarily as objects rather than as texts, as things to be preserved rather than as knowledge to be engaged with. The books that are described here are almost certainly all destroyed now. Medieval books didn't last well. Paper decayed, leather bindings rotted or eaten by insects and rodents. Water damage destroyed countless volumes. The religious texts in Latin are gone. The book on hunting is gone. Those 6 mysterious volumes in the North Tower, if they ever existed, they're certainly gone now. 500 years of decay have taken their toll. But the knowledge contained in those books, some of it survives elsewhere. The religious texts have been copied many times over the centuries. The book on hunting, there are probably other copies, or at least other hunting books from the medieval period that contain similar information. But the specific volumes that the castle owned, the specific copies with their specific water damage and their specific conditions, those are gone. They've been lost to time. You're reading about wasted potential. The castle owned books. The castle possessed knowledge. But the castle didn't use that knowledge. The castle didn't engage with it. The castle just stored it, preserved it, documented it, the way it documented everything else. And when the books decayed, as all medieval books eventually do, the knowledge was lost. This is one of the ways that human knowledge has been lost throughout history. Mirrors and the vanity of preservation. You're reading about something unexpected now. Mirrors. The castle owns mirrors. This is striking because mirrors were expensive and rare in the medieval period. Most people never saw their own reflection. Most people went through their entire lives never knowing exactly what they looked like. But the castle owns mirrors. The castle has given its inhabitants the ability to see themselves. You read, one large mirror, framed in gilded wood, surface somewhat damaged by spotting, approximately 4 feet in height. You read, 2 smaller mirrors, one with a silver frame, one with a wooden frame, both in serviceable condition. You read, a polished metal mirror, old, possibly Romang, surface pitted with age, value unknown. The mirrors are described almost with reverence. They're valuable items. They're made of expensive materials. The large mirror is framed in gilded wood. Someone spent time and resources creating a beautiful frame for this mirror. The silver-framed mirror required silver, which is precious. And then there's the polished metal mirror that might be Roman. That's an antique, something that's possibly centuries old, something that's been passed down, something that carries history. But what's striking about the mirror descriptions is that the inventory is noting the damage, the deterioration, the ways that the mirrors are failing to work properly. Surface somewhat damaged by spotting. This means that the mirror's reflective surface is corroding, that the mercury backing, if it's a true mirror with a mercury backing, is deteriorating, that the mirror is slowly becoming less useful as a mirror. Surface pitted with age on the Roman mirror. This suggests that the metal is corroding, that the reflective surface is being destroyed by time. The mirrors are breaking down. They're still functional. Apparently, the inventory doesn't say that they're completely unusable, but they're deteriorating. And the deterioration is being carefully documented. What does it mean that the castle owns mirrors? What does it mean that the lord or lady of the castle can look at their own reflection? In a world where most people never see what they actually look like, the mirror becomes almost a magical object. It's proof that you exist. It's proof that you have a physical form. It's proof that you're real. But the mirror is also a vanity. The word mirror itself has become associated with vanity, looking at yourself, admiring yourself, being concerned with your own appearance. The castle owns mirrors because the castle is vain. The castle wants to look at itself. The castle wants to know what it looks like. The castle wants to see its own reflection and confirm that it's beautiful, that it's powerful, that it's worth looking at. And yet, the mirrors are deteriorating. The reflective surfaces are corroding. The mirrors are slowly becoming less effective at doing what they're meant to do. The castle is trying to preserve its image, trying to maintain its ability to see itself. But the mirrors themselves are decaying. The vanity that the mirrors represent is slowly being destroyed by time. There's something almost philosophical about this. The mirrors are meant to show you yourself, to allow you to contemplate your own image, to satisfy your vanity. But the mirrors themselves are temporary. The reflective surface will eventually corrode completely. The frame will decay. The mirror will cease to function, and the castle owner will be left without the ability to see their own reflection. This is true of all the items in the inventory, of course. All of them are temporary. All of them are decaying. But the mirrors seem to carry an extra burden of meaning. The mirrors are tools for seeing. The mirrors are tools for self-awareness. And they're broken. They're damaged. They're losing their ability to function. The inventory is documenting the castle owners' attempt to preserve their own image. By owning mirrors, by keeping them functional, by maintaining them, the castle owner is trying to hold on to a reflection of themselves, to preserve some trace of their own appearance, to insist that they matter enough to deserve to see themselves. But the mirrors are failing. The reflective surfaces are spotting. The metal is pitting. In a few more decades, in a few more centuries, the mirrors will no longer work. The castle owner will no longer be able to see their reflection, and the castle owner will be dead anyway. The lord or lady of the castle who looked into this mirror 500 years ago has been dead for centuries. But the mirror will still exist, in some form, still preserved in the castle, still documented in the inventory, still testifying to the castle owner's vanity, still bearing the marks of decay. You're reading about the futility of vanity. The castle owner wanted to see themselves. The castle owner owned mirrors so that they could look at their own reflection. But the mirrors are broken. The reflection is no longer clear, and the castle owner is gone anyway. The vanity has decayed along with the mirrors. Historians still argue about the role of mirrors in medieval castle life. Some scholars suggest that mirrors were primarily practical. You needed a mirror to shave, to dress properly, to ensure that your appearance was appropriate. Other scholars argue that mirrors were primarily about vanity. You owned a mirror because you wanted to look at yourself, because you valued your own appearance, because you wanted to confirm that you were beautiful or powerful or important. But the mirrors don't care about the distinction. The mirrors are just broken. The mirrors are just decaying. And the castle owner is just gone. And all that remains is the documentation. One large mirror, framed in gilded wood, surface somewhat damaged by spotting, approximately 4 feet in height. You're holding the inventory, and you're reading about the mirror, and you understand the stable's animals reduced to categories and numbers. You've turned to a section that documents something living, but the living things have been reduced to the same kind of objectification as everything else. The horses, the hunting dogs, the hawking birds, all of them listed, all of them counted, all of them reduced to categories and quantities. You read 37 horses, various ages and conditions, including 6 war horses of good quality, 12 palfreys suitable for riding, 15 pack horses, and 4 others of uncertain purpose. You read 20 hunting dogs of various breeds, some elderly, some young, in generally good health. You read 12 hawks for hunting, including 2 gerfalcons of exceptional quality, 6 peregrines, and 4 lesser birds. The animals are inventory items. They're being counted the same way the linens are counted, the same way the copper pots are counted. The animals have become objects. But there's something particularly uncomfortable about this reduction of living creatures to numbers and categories. The horses, at least, it's some description of purpose. War horses. Palfreys for riding. Pack horses. The castle understands that different horses have different functions. But even this functional description is a kind of reduction. The war horses are valuable because they're trained for war. The palfreys are valuable because they're suitable for riding. The pack horses are valuable because they can carry things. The 4 horses, of uncertain purpose, are the only ones that seem to have any kind of individual status. The castle isn't quite sure what they're for, so they're just listed as existing without a clear function. The hunting dogs get slightly more respect in the description. Some elderly, some young, in generally good health. This suggests that someone actually knows the dogs, knows that some of them are old, knows that they're mostly healthy. There's a hint of individual knowledge here, a sense that the person writing the inventory has actually spent time around the dogs, has observed them, knows something about their condition beyond just dog exists. But the hawks are reduced to categories: gerfalcons, peregrines, lesser birds. The hawks are valuable according to their breed. The gerfalcons are of exceptional quality. This means they're rare, they're powerful, they're worth more money. The peregrines are worth less. The lesser birds are worth even less. The hawks have been reduced to their economic value. Their actual nature is birds. Their individuality, their personalities, none of that matters. What matters is what breed they are and how much they're worth. You begin to understand that the inventory is fundamentally a tool of commodification. Everything in the castle has been turned into a commodity. The animals are commodities. The animals exist only as items of value. The animals have no existence independent of their utility to the castle. The war horses exist because the castle needs horses for war. The hunting dogs exist because the castle needs dogs for hunting. The hawks exist because the castle needs birds for hawking. But the animals are also temporary commodities. The horses will age and become less useful. The dogs will die. The hawks will die or escape or lose their hunting skills. The animals are not like the copper pots, which can last centuries if they're maintained. The animals are temporary. The animals will need to be replaced. And the inventory doesn't tell you what happens to the animals when they're no longer useful. The elderly hunting dogs, what happens to them? Are they still fed? Are they allowed to live out their days in the castle? Or are they killed when they're no longer able to hunt? The inventory doesn't care about this question. The inventory just notes that the dogs are elderly and then moves on. The 37 horses represent an enormous investment. Horses are expensive to buy, expensive to feed, expensive to maintain. The castle has invested significant resources in acquiring and maintaining these horses. But the inventory treats them as just another category of property, no different from the tapestries or the copper pots. And yet horses are conscious beings. Horses can suffer. Horses can experience fear, pain, discomfort. Horses can form bonds with the people who care for them. The castle is owning these conscious beings. The castle is responsible for them. And the inventory is documenting that responsibility in the most clinical, unemotional way possible. This is one of the ways that the inventory becomes almost obscene. It's reducing living creatures to numbers. It's treating consciousness as if it were just another property right. It's documenting the castle's ownership of beings that can experience suffering, and it's doing so without any acknowledgement of that suffering, without any recognition of the complexity of what it means to own another conscious being. The animals that are described here are almost certainly all dead now. 500 years have passed. The 37 horses are all dead. The 20 hunting dogs are all dead. The 12 hawks are all dead. They've all been dead for centuries. They lived their lives. They served the castle. They experienced whatever experiences horses and dogs and hawks experience when they're owned and used by humans, and then they died. Historians still argue about animal welfare in the medieval period. Some scholars suggest that medieval people actually cared for their animals, that they formed bonds with them, that they understood them as more than just property. Other scholars argue that animals were simply commodities, that they were used up and discarded without much concern for their welfare. But the inventory doesn't care about any of this. The inventory just documents that the animals existed, that they were owned by the castle, that they had a particular value. You're reading about the erasure of animal consciousness. The animals existed. They were alive. They experienced the world. They had preferences and fears and needs. But the inventory reduces all of that to numbers. 37 horses, 20 dogs, 12 hawks. The animals have been converted into digits, into abstract categories, into items on the list. And in doing so, what the inventory omits becomes the true history. You're nearing the end of the document now, and you've begun to understand that the inventory is not a complete picture of the castle. The inventory is selective. The inventory documents what the castle owner thought was important enough to list. And by doing so, the inventory reveals what the castle owner thought was unimportant, what wasn't worth documenting, what was considered too mundane or too worthless to include in the official record. The inventory tells you what the castle owned, but it doesn't tell you how the castle lived. The inventory lists the furniture, but it doesn't tell you where people actually sat. The inventory catalogs the linens, but it doesn't tell you which beds people slept in, how they slept, whether they were comfortable. The inventory documents the food supplies, but it doesn't tell you what people actually ate, whether they were well fed, whether they went hungry. Most importantly, the inventory doesn't tell you about the people. You've glimpsed them briefly: John the kitchen master, Margaret the scullery maid, old Thomas, who had been in service for 40 years. But you know almost nothing about them. You don't know their ages. You don't know their names fully, just first names, if that. You don't know their lives, their families, their hopes, their dreams. The inventory mentions them only in passing, only when their function was necessary to explain something about the objects they managed. The castle owner is almost completely absent from the inventory. You don't know the lord or lady's name. You don't know what they looked like. You don't know their personality, their interests, their character. The inventory documents what they owned, but it doesn't document them. They're a ghost in their own castle. They're the presumed owner of all these objects, but they're never actually present in the document. This is the fundamental limitation of the inventory as a historical source. The inventory tells you what was in the castle, but it doesn't tell you what the castle was actually like to live in. The inventory tells you that the castle owned 2,000 candles, but it doesn't tell you what it felt like to live in candlelight, to experience the flickering shadows, to understand the constant threat of darkness. The inventory tells you that the castle owned tapestries depicting scenes, but it doesn't tell you what it felt like to look at them, to understand them, to derive meaning from them. The inventory is an archaeological artifact. It's a document that you can excavate meaning from, but the meaning is not straightforward. The inventory is a collection of facts that you have to interpret. What does it mean that the castle owned so many linens? What does it mean that the castle owned precious metals? What does it mean that the castle owned so many candles? The inventory documents the facts, but the interpretation is up to you. And the interpretation is always incomplete. You're reading a document that was written 500 years ago by someone you'll never know, about a castle that no longer exists in the form it existed, and then about people who are all dead, about objects that have mostly decayed or been lost or been repurposed. You're trying to reconstruct the world from fragments, from lists, from the careful notation of objects. But what the inventory omits is actually more revealing than what it includes. The inventory doesn't tell you about daily life. The inventory doesn't tell you about the texture of existence. The inventory doesn't tell you about suffering or joy or love or hate, or any of the things that actually make up a human life. The inventory only tells you about stuff, objects, things that can be counted and measured and valued. So the true history of the castle is not in the inventory. The true history is in what's not written down. The true history is in the lives of the servants who are barely mentioned. The true history is in the experiences of the lord and lady who are never named. The true history is in the daily rhythms of life, the small moments of happiness or pain, the texture of existence that no inventory could ever capture. You're holding a document that's both revealing and utterly inadequate. The inventory reveals the castle owner's obsession with accumulation, with documentation, with the preservation of objects. But it reveals almost nothing about what life was actually like in the castle. It reveals almost nothing about the human experience of living in that place. Historians still argue about how to use inventories as historical sources. Some scholars focus on what the inventory tells you, the economic status of the castle owner, the types of goods that were available, the structure of medieval commerce and trade. Other scholars focus on what the inventory doesn't tell you, the actual lived experience, the social relationships, the emotional life of the people in the castle. But what seems clear is that the inventory is a biased source. The inventory tells you what the castle owner wanted documented. The inventory omits what the castle owner didn't think was important. And what wasn't important to the castle owner, based on the inventory, was anything to do with actual human experience. The castle owner cared about objects. The castle owner cared about accumulation. The castle owner cared about documentation. But the actual lives of the people in the castle, that seems to have been invisible to the castle owner, irrelevant, unworthy of documentation. So you're reading a document that tells you everything about nothing. You're reading about an enormous quantity of objects, but you relearning nothing about what it was actually like to exist in the presence of those objects. You're reading about a castle that's completely full of stuff, and you're understanding nothing about what that fullness meant to the people who live there. The true history of the castle is in the gaps. The true history is in what's not written. The true history is in the lives that the inventory erases. The final page and the silence that follows. You've reached the end of the inventory. The last page. The final items listed. The document concludes not with a summary, not with a conclusion, not with any kind of closing statement that would give the inventory a sense of completion. It just stops. The last item is listed, and then the inventory is over. You read the final entries. Miscellaneous items of wood and iron, purpose unclear, stored in the western tower, quantity not fully determined. Broken furniture awaiting repair or recasting, various pieces, condition poor, remainder of stores, quantity unknown, stored in various locations throughout the castle. And then nothing. The inventory ends. There's no final accounting. There's no summary of total value. There's no conclusion about what all of this means. This is the most honest part of the inventory. The final entries admit what the entire document has been implying all along, that the castle's possessions are too vast, too numerous, too scattered to be fully catalogued. There are items whose purpose is unclear. There's broken furniture that might be repaired or might be melted down for materials. There are stores whose quantity is unknown, stored in various locations, not fully accounted for. The castle has so much stuff that it doesn't even know what it all is. The castle has accumulated so much that documentation becomes impossible. The inventory is an attempt to make the accumulation manageable, to bring order to chaos, to document the undocumentable. And by the end, the inventory has admitted defeat. The final entries are almost notes of surrender. We don't know what this is. We don't know where that is. We don't know the quantity. You're holding 500 years of silence now. The inventory is over. The list has ended. And what comes after is nothing. Nothing but the decay of objects, the slow crumbling of the castle, the passage of time that will eventually render every single item in this inventory irrelevant, unimportant, turned to dust. The castle that this inventory describes no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The objects are gone. The people are gone. The structure itself might still stand. Many medieval castles still exist, still stand as ruins or as preserved historical sites. But the castle as it existed when this inventory was written, the castle as a functioning human space filled with people and objects and daily life, that castle is completely gone. And all that remains is this document, this list, this careful notation of what was there 500 years ago. The inventory is a ghost. The inventory is the only way to access the castle that no longer exists. The inventory is the only evidence that the castle ever existed at all, in the form it existed in when someone walked through it with a ledger and wrote down what they saw. You've spent hours reading this inventory. You've accumulated knowledge about linens and copper and wine and armor and tapestries and books and mirrors and animals and candles. You've read about the castle's obsession with documentation, its desperate attempt to make permanent something that is fundamentally temporary. You've read about the castle owner's desire to preserve, to protect, to maintain control over an overwhelming accumulation of stuff. But in the end, the preservation failed. The objects decayed. The documentation couldn't stop time. The inventory couldn't prevent the inevitable dissolution of everything it listed. The castle owner could write down what they owned, but they couldn't make it last. They couldn't make it permanent. They couldn't prevent it all from eventually becoming dust. The silence that follows the end of the inventory is the silence of 500 years. It's the silence of the castle that no longer exists. It's the silence of the people who are all dead. It's the silence of objects that have decayed beyond recognition. It's the silence of knowledge that has been lost, of stories that will never be told, of daily life that has been completely erased from human memory. But the inventory remains. The inventory is the only voice that speaks from that silence. The inventory is the only witness to what the castle was, to what the castle contained, to the fact that the castle ever existed at all. The inventory is a kind of memorial. The inventory is a kind of prayer to objects, asking that they be remembered, asking that someone 500 years later might read their descriptions and understand that they existed, that they mattered, that they were worth documenting. Historians still argue about what inventories actually reveal. Some scholars focus on the economic information, what these items tell us about medieval trade, about wealth distribution, about the lives of the wealthy. Other scholars focus on the human information, what these items tell us about daily life, about values, about what medieval people cared about. But what seems clear is that the inventory is a document about absence. The inventory is about things that are no longer there. The inventory is about a world that no longer exists. You're holding the inventory in your hands now, at the end of it, and you understand that you've been reading a document about loss. Every item in the inventory is something that has been lost. Every description is a description of something that no longer exists. Every careful notation is documentation of impermanence. The castle owner created this inventory to make permanence. The castle owner was trying to hold on to something, to preserve something, to document something in the desperate hope that documentation would make it permanent. But it didn't work. The objects decayed anyway. The castle fell anyway. The people died anyway. And 500 years later, all that remains is the list, the words, the ghost of a castle that no longer exists. You close the inventory. The candlelight flickers. The stone walls of the castle are cold around you. And you understand that you've been reading the only evidence that the castle ever was. You've been holding in your hands the only thing that survived, the only voice from 500 years of silence, the only thing that remembers what the castle contained, what the castle was, the fact that the castle ever existed at all. And now the silence returns. The inventory is closed. The castle is gone again. All that remains is the memory of reading the list, the fading impression of objects that you'll never see, the understanding that 500 years ago, someone walked through a castle and wrote down what they saw, and that their writing is all that's